instructed folks to remember certain important events, and how important it is for us to remember your faithfulness and to be ever watchful that straying from them has big consequences. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Tonight we're going to look at Purim and Hanukkah. In researching, they call them two lesser feasts. But Purim here, I've always known that it was about Esther and the situation that went on there. I didn't realize that there was kind of a big stink about it, not only among Jews, but among other folks, and we'll dig into that here in just a minute. Purim is very unique. It's one of the two times that the Bible includes a very lengthy narrative about the historical origin of the feast. The first one is Passover, the events leading up to the Exodus from Egypt, and that is celebrated on the first day of the first month in the calendar. God told them when he initiated Passover that this would be the beginning of the year for you. And the other one here is Purim, and it's God's deliverance of Jews from the edict of Ahasuerus, who was the king of the Medes and the Persians. It is celebrated on the 14th day of Adar, which is the 12th month, the last month, and it's exactly one full moon before Passover. But what is really interesting about the differences between the two and what makes Purim so unique, obviously God instituted Passover, and he was very careful in telling Moses all of the things that they were to do, how it was supposed to be done, and we'll see a little bit later that some of the language is different with this one. It is the latest feast that is instituted in Old Testament times, around 400 BC. We go into the silent years between the Old Testament and the New Testament with this situation. But the other thing that makes it so interesting is initially they celebrated Passover in Egypt, but then it's changed when they left Egypt. And so the way that it was instituted is celebrated not in a foreign land. But Purim was celebrated in foreign land. And it continued that way for a while because obviously Israel was not its own entity for a long time. The timing of it is also very interesting. As we've been going through here, we've noticed that there are some feasts, grape harvest and things like that, that would be different because you would have a difference in when you harvested throughout the nation of Israel. But the big feasts, God says on such and such a day, you're going to celebrate in this manner, and you're either going to travel to the temple or it's going to be something that you observe at home. It's going to start either with a holy convocation or end with a holy convocation, or sometimes both. And there are specific sacrifices that are listed out, and there are specific things, and all of those things were a reminder to them of the event that happened. Purim is different, though, because it's not specific like that. In the kingdom, okay, so you have, well, let's turn to Esther chapter 8. I'm operating on the assumption that you are well aware of the account of Esther and what happens with Mordecai and Naaman and his intent to wipe out the Jews, and the edict that Ahasuerus signs, and all of the stuff that happens there. In Esther chapter 8 in verse 3, "And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come into my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Now, we always talk about the boldness of Esther here in asking, because if he doesn't extend the scepter, she's a dead lady. Okay? We understand that. What you don't understand is she asks the king to do an impossible thing, literally. She says, "Can you send out letters and reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha?" Now the problem is, if the king sealed those letters, then it's irreversible. You go back to the Daniel situation, getting ready to be put in the lion's den. Once the king realizes what he's done, and his friend Daniel's getting ready to be lowered into the lion's den, he spends all night trying to figure out if there's some way that he can change it or prevent Daniel from going into the lion's den, because he can't, because of one of the laws of the Medes and the Persians is, once the king makes a declaration, it's set in stone and it has to happen. And the whole concept behind it is a good one, because they want the king to very carefully think through and have counselors that are going to devise a good law, because once you enact this law, you can't take it back. That's the thinking. And so when the king sets something out, hopefully it's gone through and it's been carefully thought out and carefully planned to the extent that, a year later you don't want to change it back because it was a bad law. Okay? It ended up getting Daniel in trouble, and we have the same situation here. How does Ahasuerus go back and undo what has been done? That's the problem that we see here. Look at verse 8. "Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse." And so what he basically says is, I can't reverse what I already sent out because I sealed it with the king's ring. But I'm going to allow you to write to all the Jews in my name, and you can write whatever you want to and seal it. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and the rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in King Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by posts on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Okay, here's the solution that they come up with. Mordecai says, okay, we can't reverse what the king sent out, but what we can do is we can allow these folks to have the power to stand against it. And so they're going to send these letters out, and everybody's going to be able to assemble, and basically what happens is you got all these Jews who are gathered together ready to fight. And if anybody decides that they are going to carry out the commandments of the now dead Haman, then they're allowed to, because that's what the law says, and it can't be reversed. But just because it can't be reversed doesn't mean it has to be obeyed. All right? Haman's already dead and hung on his gallows. Okay? And so we're going to allow all these Jews to gather together and arm themselves. And if these folks decide that they're still going to carry this out, then they are allowed to withstand them and kill as many of them as they want to and take all of their spoil, and that's okay with King Ahasuerus. Interesting way of dealing with the problem. So this edict here from Mordecai allows them to defend themselves and to stop anyone that comes against them and attacks them. It also allows them to take the spoils of the slain, which is an interesting way for Mordecai to do this, because Haman, when he writes, you go and hunt out any Jew you want to and kill them wherever you find them, Hitler style, right? Round them up and kill them. When Mordecai writes to defend themselves, you guys gather yourselves together, and then you wait and see if anybody comes against you. And if they come to try and kill you, then you have the right to kill them and take all of the stuff that they have. Now, you go down to verses 15 through 17. Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. In the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. And so word has spread that the Jews are going to be allowed to defend themselves. Word has already gotten out that Naaman is dead. So basically you have a situation where instead of hunting people where they work and where they're doing whatever, dragging them out into the streets and killing them, and now you have folks that you know are able to defend themselves. You know the ringleader of this whole thing is dead by commandment of the king, and if you choose to do this, you know the king is now favoring the Jews. And obviously people chose to do it anyway. Go to chapter 9. It's time for Haman's. It's Haman, right? I keep getting him confused. It's Haman. What? Yeah, it's Haman. He had a date set so that folks would have time to prepare for it, okay? And so here it is. Time is upon them. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for fear of them fell upon all people. Now, this is on the 13th day of Adar, and you would think that if you were going to celebrate Purim, you would celebrate it on the day that the fight took place. Isn't that the way we celebrate most of our holidays? D-Day. We don't celebrate after D-Day when, we celebrate D-Day. That's when they launched the battle, but that's not what Purim is. Purim is not the day that everybody fought for their lives. And so the thinking behind Purim and the way we celebrate in the West is a little bit different in their thinking. So in Shushan the palace, 13th day of Adar, it's about to go down. Now jump down to verse 6. And in Shushan the palace, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. Now jump down to verse 10, because it's going to talk about the sons of Haman, and we don't need to deal with that. Now verses 10 through 15. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. You're going to hear that phrase over and over again. On that day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition, and it shall be granted thee? Or what is thy request further, and it shall be done? Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. So in the palace area, on the 13th, they slew 500 men, but the job isn't done. And so on the 14th, and think about this, 500 people have died the day before in the palace city, in the complex. Haman's already gone. They hang his 10 sons out there on the gallows so that everybody knows. But the next day, they do the same thing. They get ready to defend themselves, and there's 300 more people in the king's palace area that come after them. 800 people in the city of Shushan come after the Jews on a 2-day period. They did not take any of the spoils. Now what's interesting, and where the timing of Purim gets really interesting, you look at verse 18. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th day thereof. And on the 15th day of the same they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. And so they started Purim in Shushan the palace on the 15th because they were fighting on the 13th and the 14th. They celebrated the day after. God has given us the victory. It's over and done with. But now, go back to verses 16 and 17. Because in all the provinces, and the Bible refers to them also as unwalled towns, in verses 16 and 17 it says, But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, rested, and they made it a day of feasting and gladness. And so here's the problem. All of the rest of the provinces on the 13th are fighting for their lives. They kill 75,000 people in the 127 provinces. They're over and done with. So they celebrate on the 14th. But in Shushan the palace, they're still killing people who are coming after them. So when they're done killing people on the 14th, they celebrate on the 15th. So you have half of the people celebrating on the 14th, and you have the folks in Shushan the palace celebrating on the 15th. So what do you do with this situation? Well, this feast is different than other feasts. In chapter 9, verse 18 and 22, if you look at the wording, this feast is a mishtah, which is different than what we have been studying. We have been studying what is described as a hag. And a mishtah is more of a drinking feast and a celebrating feast, where a hag is more of a festival and a eating and a more detailed, outlined feast. Okay? The other big difference that you have here is the word that describes Purim is a zaman, an appointed time to celebrate. That's what it means. It literally means an arrangement of time in Aramaic. But all of the other feasts, when you read them in the Hebrew, are moeds, which means a feast. Moed, which literally translated means before the Lord. So this feast is not a feast that happens before the Lord. It doesn't have a religious significance to it. It doesn't have, it's not one of the things that God said, this is statement of my character, this is even though it is a statement of his faithfulness. Okay? And so there is a big difference between the way Jews look at Purim and Hanukkah and the way they look at the other feasts. You say, well, what do they do for observation then? Well, Purim comes from the word pur, which literally means a broken piece. So the title means the failed plan of destruction by Haman. I keep wanting to call him Naaman. In chapter 9, verses 27 through 32, we see it institutionalized as something that is meant for all of the nation of Israel and not just for the folks that are living under the control of the Medes and the Persians. All right? So you look at verse 27, and it says, The Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. Now, it's interesting that they actually, there's your word, mishta, appointed time, or zaman, appointed time, listed right there. But notice, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed. Who institutionalized all the other feasts? God did. And that's why he uses different words to describe it, because when he institutionalizes it, he describes the feast as before the Lord. But this is something that the Jews took upon themselves to do. And because some of the folks celebrated on the 14th and some of them celebrated on the 15th, instead of it being a one-day feast, it becomes a two-day feast. Except the 14th is celebrated by all of the towns, the unwalled cities. The 15th is when all of the walled cities celebrated it. So in Jerusalem, as long as you have a walled city, they would have celebrated on the 15th, but all of the towns that are out and around about them would have celebrated on the 14th. Only what happens when the Romans come in 70 AD and destroy the city? Now Jerusalem, Israel, not just Jerusalem, now Israel doesn't have a walled city to celebrate on the 15th, and so everybody celebrates Purim on the 14th, when all of the other towns celebrated it. I don't know. You look up and some people still do a two-day feast. Why not? If you're going to have a holiday, it's better to have 2 days in 1 day, right? That's Purim. That's what it is. That's what it is for. Not necessarily instituted of the Lord. Now, the other problem that you run into is a lot of folks say, well, this isn't an official Israeli feast because for a long time they didn't recognize Esther as included in the Bible. There is no use of God's name himself. There is no phrases throughout the entire book of Esther, thus saith the Lord, or the Lord said, or the word of the Lord came unto. And so for a long time they argued about the canonicity of the book of Esther, and they argued about whether or not this should be a feast. But obviously, now the most important leaders of the nation of Israel at the time instituted this and meant it for the whole nation, and so that's how Purim came about. Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, that's what the word means. The Greeks entered the temple during the Hellenization period, and you have Maccabeus, I can't remember his name, should have wrote it down, sacrifices a pig in the temple, and then goes around and he destroys all of the oil that they were using to light the menorah in there, and does away with the showbread, and he thinks that he has basically destroyed all of the worship there. Well, now they've got a problem because the temple has been destroyed and they don't have the things they need to, and so you have the group of nationalists there who rise up and they throw them out, and when they throw them out and they kind of set Israel up for a little while as an independent state again, they go into the temple and they want to start burning the menorah. The only problem is all of the sacred oil that has been blessed and set aside for that has been destroyed by these folks. But they look through the whole temple and they find one jar of oil that still bears the high priest's emblem. And so it has been sanctified and it's okay to use in the menorah. So they pour it in there and they light the menorah, and they realize that it's only going to burn for 1 day. And they begin to cleanse the temple. And the interesting thing, and the reason that they celebrate Hanukkah, is that 1 day oil was enough to light the lamp, and it burned for 8 days, which is the time period that it took them to cleanse the temple from these guys being in there terrorizing it. In John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, we have one of the few references to it. It talks about Jesus walking by the pool of Bethesda at the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. What did they do during these 8 days? It doesn't talk about sacrifices. It doesn't talk about feasting. It doesn't necessarily even talk about journeying down to Jerusalem. So the fact that Jesus was there during that time period was not a requirement. It wasn't something he had to do like the 3 big feasts. But during the 8 days of Hanukkah, they rejoiced by reciting the Hallel, and and celebrating. The length of oil lasted the whole time, and so they celebrate the whole time because they look at it as an important intervention. And so it's not something that God set up. God didn't say, I want you to have this holiday, and you're going to start on this day with a holy convocation and do no servile work, and you're going to go to the 8th day and have a holy convocation and no servile work. None of that language is used with Hanukkah either. But Hanukkah is also called the Feast of Lights because the city was illuminated. 2 reasons: for joy. These folks that came into the temple and sacrificed a pig and desecrated it, and that has been defeated, and now the temple is being cleansed and ready for worship again. But it was also a joyous occasion, and so they had lights all over the city while they are cleaning up the temple and while they are celebrating. The feast began on the 25th day of Chesley, or what would be our 15th day of December. And so right around Christmas time, you hear anybody that doesn't want to offend somebody, they're running around saying, happy Kwanzaa, happy Hanukkah, happy everything. And folks naturally assume that Hanukkah is the Jewish person's Christmas. Does Hanukkah have anything to do with Christmas? No, it's a complete misunderstanding of what they're celebrating. They're simply celebrating when they took back the temple and were able to cleanse it, and God miraculously allowed the menorah to burn for 8 days instead of running out of oil on the first day. And so the nation chose to get together and celebrate, and they light one candle on the menorah for each of the 8 days to commemorate the oil that was burning, and they use it as a time of explaining God's faithfulness, even though Purim and Hanukkah weren't set up by God with the same things that he meant to teach the nation of Israel with the other feasts. Okay? So they are lesser feasts, and they do observe them, but they don't have the significance. Obviously, they do. Israel, they're pretty glad that they didn't get wiped out by Haman, and they're glad that they got their temple back, even though it was short-lived. Praises or prayer requests?